Chris Bishop, and welcome to this special edition of Political Capital. We're coming to you from inside Treasury in Pretoria. This is the main boardroom, and across this table was discussed the decision by Moody's, the ratings agency, to keep South Africa above the junk status, which is good news for the economy. And I'm here to speak to Finance Minister Nhlanhla Nene about where next for the South African economy as it tries to grow and rebuild. So thank you very much for your time, Minister. When it came to Friday night, I mean, were you sure? How nervous were you when the Moody's decision was coming out?
Look, I think I can say I was not very nervous but anxious because I mean, having engaged with Moody's the week after my appointment, and had a series of other meetings, and then after that, when we went to London to meet with investors, we met with Moody's again, and it's almost like they wanted to confirm our story. And I think we had a credible story, and we also had a very, a good team. But also, it's not a story we were making up. It is a story that actually presents itself in a way. And the team that we took to London of business, labor, and ourselves was a team that actually, spoke from the same hymn book. And on Thursday in the week Moody's was here, we also met with a few of my colleagues also other ministers, who, like Minister of Energy, Minister of Public Enterprise, Minister of Trade and Industry, Minister of Economic Development. We didn't have to make up the story. It is a story that was unfolding, a country that is in a process of rebuilding itself.
A lot of people I've spoken to in business say this is no time for complacency.
Absolutely.
You have to do a lot more.
I agree with you.
What are you planning to do very rapidly in the next 6 months?
Look, it's a collective effort again, as I said, with particularly the ministers in the economics cluster, but everybody is actually hard at work to make sure that this really works. Because if you look at the things that we're focusing on, ranging from inspiring confidence, that's not a matter for one minister or one individual. We actually are building on the mood that is already prevailing on the ground, but all of us have to do something in order to actually inspire that confidence. Policy certainty is critical, but economic growth is at the center of everything, so that is our main focus. But in focusing on economic growth, we also need a very sustainable balance sheet, a sovereign balance sheet. So we do need to look after the fiscus and also address the risks that might actually have an impact on that, ranging from state-owned companies that are ailing and some of them that require immediate attention, but also making sure that we focus on the sectors that would actually generate the growth that we require.
We're going to talk a bit more about borrowing in a minute, but firstly, what do you think the average business person out there in South Africa is going to notice? What are the physical signs we're going to see of rapid change in this economy?
Look, the environment itself needs to be conducive to doing business. There are questions, you do get questions in relation to some of the key areas, the energy sector in particular, where we do need to do something, the mining sector. We do need to accelerate some of the policy decisions and areas of intervention, including the passing of legislation, the MPRDA being one of them. We also need, business also needs a stable environment in our finances as the country, and being able to play a role. An example of the Youth Employment Service Initiative that came out of a program between government and the private sector is one of those that I think are beginning to gain traction. And I think the President will be launching that tomorrow. And there's a commitment, and they also want to see that government is indeed committed to this partnership and relationship between the public and the private sector.
You mentioned the mining charter there. Your mining minister in Cabinet has said he's going to sort this out within 3 months. It's now just over 2 months left for that deadline. Obviously, it's something that the ratings agencies look very carefully at when they're making their decisions. How worried are you may not be able to sort it out swiftly and agreeably to all parties?
Look, I'm encouraged by his optimism. This is a world that requires us to be, even if it means overly optimistic on some of this. But as we get down to business, that's where our commitment gets tested. And I think working with all the stakeholders in that space, even if it doesn't meet the deadline, but the commitment will actually begin to yield results.
And what about growth? We're talking about, was it 1.5% maybe this year? What's your plan? What's your hope for growth in the future?
Look, if we are to build on the positive mood that is on the ground, we are likely to actually achieve even better than that. As you have seen, we're lucky that last quarter results for last year actually came up and surprised us on the upside, which is a good base to build on. And again, as you said earlier, there is no room for complacency. We need to build on that and make sure that we do some of those things. The structural reforms we're talking about, with confidence actually being at the base of it. Because if with confidence alone, actually it's a currency on its own. And then things like focusing on the sectors like agriculture and tourism, where we are placing a particular focus, dealing with the issue in telecommunications, the spectrum and the broadband in particular, focusing on the transport and logistics in that space, but also beginning to look at some of the barriers to entry into the business space. All of those things, as I said, requires that collective approach, and it is already in government's program, as outlined by the President in his State of the Nation address and the Minister of Finance when he tabled the budget this year.
You mentioned the fiscus earlier. Surely it's going to be a very difficult job for a man like yourself. You're being asked to spend more on the one side. On the other side, how are you going to reduce the borrowing that's gone far too far in this country?
Well, spending more than you have is a normal dilemma of the Minister of Finance. Because the demands are always much bigger than what you can afford. But I think what's more important is improving on the quality of that spending. Where we spend the money should be where we also see the returns, both economically and socially. Because at the end of the day, where you deploy the resources should be able to buy you that. But I think one of the things, as you have correctly pointed out in terms of borrowing, is that you need to reduce, the burden on the fiscus of servicing debt. And as I said, the more you actually build the confidence, it is a currency on its own because it reduces the cost at which you are borrowing in terms of what rate you pay for the money you borrow. But at the same time, it gives you space to be able to release resources, to be able to do some of the things that your expenditure requires to focus on.
I mean, confidence may be a currency, but in terms of cold, hard numbers, have you got a target before the end of this current financial year? How much are you going to cut back that borrowing?
Look, on its own, as I said, the moment you actually are able to deal with at the moment we're looking at a debt service cost of, it costs us about 180 billion rands to actually, service our debt, during this financial year. It might not necessarily be an issue that you're spending 180. What might be an issue is your denominator. If the economy grows, it would mean that even if the denominator stays at that amount, then the percentage decreases.
As I say, what would you hope for, and what are you planning for the growth to be this time next year?
Well, this year we are looking at, we're focusing on the numbers that we've penciled in. Talk to us growing at about 1.5, going to 1.8. I would imagine we should be above 2% going forward in terms of economic growth.
And there's going to be some unpleasant things you're going to have to do along the way. I mean, one of them, everyone's crying out for the axe or whatever to be taken to these state-owned enterprises, which have cost the taxpayer a lot in losses down the years. What are you going to do there?
Look, we are embarking on a serious program with Minister Gordon, and an overall a package that begins to look at identifying the issues on each of the state-owned entities and coming up with remedial action. Remedial action ranges from the point of looking at putting in place governance, making sure that governance is in place, making sure that you deploy the right people in positions, and also looking at the financial position of each one of them, and then making sure that with the policy recommendations that have been made, and some of them already being on the table, including the private sector participation framework that has been passed already, that begins to look at when do we actually get the private sector to participate so that you boost this partnership that would generate better returns. But ultimately, you need actually to read or to win them off state resources and maintain them into supporting structures for our economy rather than benefiting from it.
Well, a lot of voices in business say, well, why don't you just privatise the state-owned enterprises, get the money into Treasury for the privatisation and cut down the losses to the taxpayer?
Look, if you look at them, I mean, the fact of the matter is that before you even get to the P word, you do need to have done a thorough audit. And I always say, and this is the conversation that we have with most of the people in the private sector, is if the private sector has confidence in some of the businesses that are in state hands, perhaps a partnership is a better deal than a situation. Because if they think they have a solution to turning them around, why don't we turn them around together? But at the same time, some of them have got an element, and that is why now the issue of identifying exactly what the developmental role is of some of the state-owned entities, but also what is the commercial role, and having the two together. It does not necessarily mean that it can't work when you have a proper partnership, but you need to clarify exactly how each one would be able to play that role and the cost of financing its developmental role as opposed to it being sustainable.
So that's all we've got time for in this first half. Stay tuned for the second half of Political Capital when we get more, perhaps more personal insights from South Africa's Finance Minister, Nhlanhla Nene. Welcome back to this special edition of Political Capital. I'm Chris Bishop, and I'm in the heart of Treasury in Pretoria, where I've been interviewing Finance Minister Nhlanhla Nene about the future of the South African economy. Just another big, tricky question that's been raised by the ratings agencies as well is the question of land. The new president, has said it's land without expropriation, without compensation. I know that he said other things since then, but a lot of people reading those headlines around the world are going to be very seriously concerned about putting their money into South Africa.
In fact, it was one of the questions that came out sharply with investors. And our response is very simple, that it is indeed a vexing question. The land issue is a vexing question. And rather than leave that outside of the formal engagement, I think what the president and what government is doing is bringing that to where it belongs, because giving it to the Constitutional Review Committee is actually making sure that it is handled in a responsible manner, and also taking into account the points that the president has made quite repeatedly of making sure that it doesn't impact negatively on economic development and growth, that it doesn't impact negatively on food security, and that it is done in an orderly fashion in terms of our constitution. So I think we actually have dealt with a challenge that otherwise could have been used as a political football, unless it is located where it is located now.
But you must appreciate, though, that a lot of investors, they don't see it perhaps in the detailed way that perhaps you and I would.
It's for that reason that when it is located where it is located, then it can be better clarified, because rather than being clarified by people who might have their own political views on the matter, because now that all stakeholders are going to get an opportunity of engaging with the question of land, but also making sure that there's a tendency also to believe that now that we're talking expropriation without compensation, it means all the other land reform programs have fallen off. We still have land reform programs that are actually already underway. But what we're also saying is that, as the Constitution provides in Section 25, that there are areas where expropriation actually should be done in terms of the Constitution, again, without a compensation.
Economically, how do you see it working, this land question? How do you see it creating wealth in your mind? Just give me an idea.
Look, there are a lot of people, and if you talk to people if you talk small-scale farmers, one of the challenges they have is, they will actually give you two quick responses if you ask what their challenges are. It would be lack of access to financing and lack of access to land in order to be able to farm. But also when we talk unemployment, one of the things that would actually come up quite strongly is the inability of our people to be able to even, do some of the things that would provide for them on a sustainable basis, but after that being able to trade. So, and the audit, a number of audits have actually been conducted, and I think we're now going to have a conclusive one that begins to identify how much of the land is actually not being used that could actually be made available to people who actually have the means and who are eager to make use of the land. And I think the starting point, in my view, would be the land that is actually not being used, and that land to be allocated in a manner that begins to be commercially active, to be able to provide employment and to provide to deal with the challenges of food security that we have.
You must have seen that first draft. Could you give us an idea what's in that report and when's it's likely to come out?
Well, the report is not there yet because the Constitutional Review Committee is going to be engaging with the stakeholders, and it is expected to be able to report back by August in the year.
And overall in the economy, I know you're very new back in the job, but...
very new, yes.
Very new indeed. But returning to the job, we'll talk about that later. But surely in any economic turnaround, there's going to be a lot of austerity and a lot of nasty medicine that people are going to have to stomach. What can we expect here in South Africa?
Look, we've seen that already. If you look at what was announced in the budget, where we would want over the coming 3 years, where we would want to, raise, revenue through painful measures, including the introduction of value-added tax, and but also on the other side, where we've the other announcement is that of reducing expenditure to the tune of about 85 billion over the 3 years. All of that is, part of the belt tightening exercise. That's the pain that we should be prepared to take. But going forward, if that actually contributes towards us rebuilding the economy, it would actually pale into insignificance.
What kind of unkind cuts are you going to have to make?
Look, those cuts actually are not so unkind, but they relate mainly to, one, reducing leakages, making sure that there is less leakage, and cutting fat, making sure also that in terms of numbers, when it comes to cost of employment, we do need to look deeply into that. But making sure that wherever we spend, we get the best value for our expenditure. We can actually still, I believe, we can do more with the less revenue that we have, but also improve that side again. Now that I've mentioned revenue, improve the side of revenue collection, but making sure that the citizens all play their part in making sure that we rebuild the country.
Speaking about value for the taxpayers' dollar, I mean, there's been this tremendous, how can I put it, almost war on corruption in the last few months, and the present president, he says he's going to see it right through to the end. What are we likely to see, you think, in the rest of the year? Are we going to see scores of former ministers and officials arraigned in court? What are we likely to see?
Well, I would imagine that everyone that is involved in any form of corruption should actually, run, because when that happens. But also, I think we're also going to reach a point where South Africans, wherever we are going to begin, because there's so many well-meaning South Africans who actually want to play a role in rebuilding the country, who want to do the right thing, but when the environment is conducive to corrupt practices, people tend to think that is the norm. So we will see a lot of people, and we are beginning to see that there's a lot of goodwill out there. A lot of people want to work towards contributing rather than milking of the state.
It's going to be very, very difficult to stamp out after so many years, being able to take root. How is the state going to deal with that?
I want to believe that the number of corrupt individuals in the country are less than the number of people, well-meaning South Africans who actually want to make it work. So it's a matter of isolating those immediately. And once they're isolated, it's either they play ball or they themselves would, find themselves where they belong. And we know where they belong.
And overall, this is your second turn in the job here. It's a return to that. I mean, it's happened to me in the past, where you actually get put back into a job you were taken out of, and you feel extra resolve. How do you feel?
Not really. I mean, I think it is a humbling opportunity to begin to look at things, from outside. And in the past 24 months, I would say, one has also learned a great deal. In my short sojourn, I dabbled in the private sector, and it's a sector that we also today are engaging with, and I think I do that now with a much more enhanced understanding of the other side. So it has actually been an interesting, a journey of my life. So now being back here, of course, a bit uncomfortable at the beginning, and I'm going to take a bit of time to learn the ropes again. So much has changed in the past 2 years, and I would really want to make my little contribution in the...
Can you just give us perhaps a story or a taste of when you came back, what it was like? It must have been very strange.
It was very strange. Firstly, I had to be able to convince my family that I've changed my mind, because otherwise I had told them that I would not. But when I got the call, it was clear that the national duty is bigger than all of us. So when called upon, it is very difficult to say no, even though I tried a bit, but didn't get very far. But
what did change your mind?
Like national duty, when you are called upon to serve the nation, it is both humbling, but at the same time, it gives you that sense of responsibility that, I'm being given this opportunity again, perhaps irrespective of what my views might have been. This is the time to put those views aside and focus on serving the nation again.
And one thing I would say that a lot of people out there, taxpayers in particular, applaud this war against corruption that I mentioned earlier. But some people might say, well, they fear sometimes that it might end up more like a purge. I don't know. What do you fear?
Look, I think we need to be honest about it. At the end of the day, when you walk into a room and there is a bit of dirt, there's likely to be a lot of, when you clean up the dirt, there is dust. And, some people actually might feel a bit uncomfortable. But I think it is the outcome thereof that we all look back and say, indeed, it was something worth doing. So I think the moment people begin to see that their money is spent where it is supposed to be spent, and that we are also all accountable, because at the end of the day, we can make a lot of noise, but if we're not seen to be accountable ourselves, then we are not likely to actually gain the confidence of the South Africans on the ground. But people should begin to see an improvement in the services that are being delivered to them. But people should also begin to see those that are not towing the line being dealt with, and dealt with aggressively. And I think people should actually begin to see the results in order for them to buy into the story.
That's all we've got time for in this special edition of Political Capital from the Treasury Boardroom in Pretoria. From me, Chris Bishop, it's goodbye. Don't forget, Political Capital will be back on Thursday night at 6:30. Do join us then. Goodbye.